Did you guys know the big bad wolf is real? And this is the true crime case of that wolf in sheep's clothing. Only in this story, Little Red Riding Hood is pregnant and the wolf comes to her house on Halloween night. This crime case is not only one of the most horrifying I've ever heard, but also one of the most tragic and sad. Come join me, Holly, in the Murder She Shed, the place we discuss the dead right in my she shed. Subscribe if you would like, no pressure. I would love to have you join us 2 times weekly for rarely discussed true crime. If you enjoy my telling of this true crime case today. But not everyone enjoys a good Southern thing. So, subscribe, don't subscribe. I don't care. I shouldn't even put it in there. All right, let's get right into this story. Doreen Ray Hitchens was born in Santa Clara, California in 1952 to Franklin and Catherine Hitchens and was the 4th of 5 children. The family was tight-knit and loving, enjoying family activities such as fishing and camping. Doreen loved to help other people. She was giving and caring. These qualities led her to pursue a career in the medical field, and she went on to become a physical therapist. She loved her job and was always seen smiling and laughing. In 1975, she met William Michael Dennis, called Mike for short, a technician at the Lockheed factory, an aerospace manufacturing plant. It was love at first sight, and a whirlwind relationship began. Doreen had told her family that she had found the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. Only after a few months of knowing each other, they ended up getting married. Doreen's family had their doubts. They thought Mike was the polar opposite of Doreen. Mike always seemed unhappy and wanted to argue with anyone else's viewpoints. Mike also suffered from extreme depression. Doreen, who always wanted to help heal others that were hurt, seemed to be attracted to Mike, partly because of her giving spirit and the need to fix his pain. Less than a year later, Doreen gave birth to a beautiful little baby boy named Paul. For a little while, this seemed to ease Mike's depression. Mike relished his role as a father. It was one thing he really seemed to enjoy in life. Mike was a great father, but not so much a great husband. Mike was so moody, and when they would come home from work, Doreen never knew what mood she would get that day. The usually easygoing and happy Doreen began to let Mike's mood rub off on her, and they started arguing a lot, mostly over financial matters. And Mike would say that Doreen was having affairs. Not proven, but this is what he said. Doreen told her family that the marriage no longer made her happy, and she was going to divorce Mike. Doreen had finally come to the conclusion she could not fix Mike. So one day in 1977, only 2 years after marrying Mike, Mike came home from work and she said, "I want a divorce." Mike loved Doreen still and was very hurt, which spiraled him into a deeper depression. Doreen was given full custody of Paul, and Mike regularly visited his son. This only further upset Mike, who loved his son more than anything else in the world. A year later, Doreen was driving home from work one day when her car broke down. So she pulled over to the side of the road, and as she got out of her car, a gentleman pulled over with curly red hair and asked if she needed any help. Doreen gladly accepted because she didn't know what else to do. The gentleman introduced himself as Charles Erbert. He opened the hood of her car, and as he worked on her car, they made such great conversation that they decided that they would just have dinner together later in the week. While they had dinner, she told Charles about her son, Paul, just right up front. He didn't seem to mind that she had a child, and she loved the stability that Charles could provide for her and Paul. He owned a home and a successful carpet business. They went on to marry later that year, and Doreen gave birth to a daughter named Deanna in 1979. Soon after, Doreen quit her job as a physical therapist and became a secretary for Charles' carpet business. Mike only lived 6 blocks away from his ex, Doreen's new husband's home, and he still continued to pick their son Paul up when it was time on the weekends to have him. Mike was bitter that Doreen had moved on without him, but they were able to remain civil to each other. Doreen's new husband, Charles, had a huge pool in his backyard, and not long after Doreen and Paul moved in, her puppy drowned in the pool. When Mike stopped by to pick Paul up one weekend to take him to his house, Doreen happened to mention their puppy had drowned in the pool they had in the backyard. This made Mike concerned of the possibility of Paul getting into the pool without adult supervision. Mike brought up the concern when he returned Paul after his weekend was over. He told Doreen if they would build a fence around the pool, he would pay for the fence. She told Mike no, he should not have to pay for the fence, but she would suggest building a fence to Charles. They did eventually build a fence for the pool. One summer, California day in the February of 1980, Mike dropped Paul off after he'd been with him all weekend, gave him a kiss goodbye. Paul was being fussy about leaving his father, wanted to visit him longer, but he told him bye. And then Doreen took him into the house, and she decided she needed to clean a bit. Paul wanted to play out back. Doreen was watching him through the window, and he was playing fine with his toy trucks out back. She kept peeking out there to see if he was okay, and he was fine. She was not worried about the pool anymore now that it was fenced off and made things easier for her. A few minutes later, she took a peek out the window but could not see Paul playing, so she ran outside. As she was yelling, "Paul, where are you?" she happened to glance toward the pool and thought, could he have somehow got through the fence? She ran over towards the pool and looked into the water. There Paul was floating face down. Doreen's screams were so loud and filled with terror that her next-door neighbor came out of the house and ran towards her. He then noticed the child in the water, dove in, and pulled Paul out. The neighbor began to perform CPR. Doreen ran to call 911. Paul was transported to the hospital where he was placed on life support for a week. After 3 days of being removed from life support, he died just short of his 4th birthday. Paul had been able to somehow squeeze through the slats of the fence. Mike was angry and blamed Doreen and Charles for Paul's death. Mike wrote Doreen a letter saying that she had drowned Paul in order to get him out of her life. Doreen was completely blindsided by this letter. Doreen had been in immense grief from Paul's death and did feel guilt over his death, but for Mike to say that she had purposely drowned their son broke her heart that he would even suggest that. Mike filed a wrongful death suit against Charles and Doreen just 2 years after the death of Paul. Mike did not win the suit, and Charles and Doreen were so tore up about the situation that they asked Mike never to come to their house again. Mike's depression grew deeper, as did his resentment. In 1984, Doreen discovered that she was pregnant again. This was good news, as she had suffered 2 miscarriages since the death of Paul in 1980. As the pregnancy progressed, they found out that she was going to have a boy. The Erbert family was ecstatic. Doreen still missed Paul and struggled with the loss. Their daughter, Dina, was now 5 years old, so they were ready for a new addition in the family. But Doreen knew it would never replace the hurt she felt in her heart for Paul. Her heart had been full of hurt in the last few years, from Paul's drowning to her 2 miscarriages. She was ready for some good to happen in her life. One day when her sister came over, she teased her that she was far out as she was high. They laughed together because Doreen only stood at 5 foot even, and as Doreen looked in the mirror, she believed it could be true. As she looked at herself, she noticed the glow in her cheeks and the smile on her face. And for the first time in a while, life felt good. Mike, on the other hand, lost his position as a technician at Lockheed and had to take a lower paying job in order to remain employed there. His girlfriend broke up with him and had left him with a parting gift, herpes. The bitterness of the divorce from Doreen and the grief over the loss of Paul continued eating at him because he lived near Doreen and Charles. He was able to keep tabs on what was happening in their lives, and it soon became apparent that she was pregnant again, and this upset Mike immensely. Mike felt like he had nothing left in life. Felt like, what have I got? Doreen got everything. And she killed the only thing I had. This is when Mike became the big bad wolf. On Halloween night in 1984, Doreen, who was almost 9 months pregnant at that time, stayed home. She just felt too tired to walk and her ankles had started swelling. So she just stayed home to have some quiet time. Meanwhile, Mike had just finished having dinner with his mother. Then they passed out candy for a bit. Talking to the children as they answered the door greatly increased his grief for Paul. It was time to get the 18-inch machete out of his closet that he had bought 6 weeks earlier. Charles and Deanna had came home from trick-or-treating, and little Deanna had dumped her candy out on the floor in order to enjoy her treats. Charles had decided to run to the liquor store and told Doreen he would be back in 15 minutes. Doreen was watching Deanna eat some of her candy. At that moment, she had chocolate on the sides of her mouth. Doreen told Deanna only 2 more pieces and then you're going to take a bath and then go to bed. Just as she was telling Deanna that, there was a loud knock on the front door. Doreen thought it was possibly a child still trick-or-treating. She had about decided not to answer the door when the knock came again. She thought, oh well, one more time won't hurt. As she answered the door, it was no child, but a man with creepy wolf head on. Thought it might have been Charles trying to play a prank on her. But unfortunately, it was not. The man suddenly raised his hand with a machete in it, and he said, I'm going to kill you. She tried to slam the door, but he was too strong. She yelled to Deanna to go hide, so Deanna ran behind the couch. Doreen began to run. She knew the wolf was Mike after she had heard his voice. So she said, Mike, why are you doing this? At this point, he had knocked her to the ground. Mike said, because you killed my son. Mike began hacking Doreen with the machete, slinging blood off the blade onto the ceiling as he slashed her. Doreen put her hand over her stomach, trying to protect her unborn baby. The machete sliced clean through her wrist into her stomach, which caused an explosion, much like a balloon filled with air and water. This expelled the baby and Doreen's now severed hand into the air, landing about a foot away from Doreen's body. Mike asked Doreen, who was now choking on her own blood, how it felt to drown. In reference to their son Paul's death, he wanted her to feel like Paul did when he died. Doreen had been hit multiple times at this point with the machete. Deanna was still hiding behind the couch, too terrified to move or cry. Mike began to hack the newborn. Deanna would later tell her dad that she had heard the newborn cry, although in later autopsy reports it showed the baby did not have any air in its lungs yet, so perhaps it was a noise her mother had made that she heard. Mike thought he heard a noise and rushed out the door, dropping his wolf mask as he left. Mike had cut his fingers during the attack and left a blood trail as he ran. After Deanna heard him leave, she crept out from behind the couch, seeing tons of blood, which scared her, so she grabbed her blanket and ran and hid back behind the couch. Not long after, Charles walked through the front door. Once he stepped inside, he saw Doreen laying bleeding on the entry room floor. He saw the baby on the living room floor too. Thinking at first she had miscarried, he saw a hand lying in the living room near the baby. It was Doreen's severed hand. Blood was everywhere and he slipped and fell on the blood as he was trying to rush to Doreen, whom was barely clinging to life. He started holding her arm tight, attempting to stop the bleeding, but this is when he noticed the cuts to her neck and head and knew that she was bleeding so badly that holding her arm would not do much good. Charles, who is now covered in blood, ran to call 911. After this, Charles found Deanna hiding in the living room. He pulled her away to the kitchen so that she couldn't see any more than she had already seen. He continued to try and stop Doreen's bleeding until help arrived. Officers that responded to the Erbert house that Halloween night says it was straight out of a Stephen King movie. There was blood covering the foyer and a jack-o'-lantern that was displayed in the house. The blood on the floor was thick and stuck to the shoes of the officer. The wolf mask had been found in the front yard near the front porch covered in blood. Some paramedics and officers needed counseling and some even quit after what they had witnessed in that household. Charles was found covered with blood and smelled of alcohol, so naturally he was the first suspect after they took downtown to question him. They soon heard the story of Doreen's ex and how he blamed Doreen for their son's death. So 12:30 that night, police headed to Mike's house. After arriving, police shined a flashlight into Mike's truck. And this is when they seen blood on the ignition switch and seat of the truck. The officers could hear running water and seen some lights on. The officers surmised that he may be cleaning up bloodied cloths or wounds. Finally, dispatch called Mike at his home and informed him that police were at his door and to answer it. Mike answered the door. He was wearing a robe and didn't look as if he'd been asleep. The sergeant explained that his ex-wife, Doreen, had been attacked and that he wanted to question him. To which Mike responded, "You're kidding." Officers noticed a blood-filled gauze on Mike's right hand and they asked him, "How did you get that cut?" Mike stated that he had done so by throwing a knife into the air and catching it by the blade. The officers asked Mike for some ID and he told them that it was upstairs. Not wanting him to go alone in case he tried to escape or get a weapon, they followed him up. They reached the master bedroom, where it appeared that Mike was confused as to where his ID was. He kept glancing towards his headboard, which made the officers suspicious. Finally, one of the officers found his wallet and Mike removed his ID from it. Mike consented to a search of his home and officers located a loaded revolver behind his headboard. The sergeant went into the garage where the washer and dryer was located and found blood drops. There were blood drops in the kitchen, a pair of blood-stained jeans on Mike's bed, bloody gauze in the bathroom garbage. Mike was taken to the station and waived his rights to an attorney and agreed to a taped interview. He denied killing Doreen. Mike was asked about any costumes he may have worn for Halloween in previous years. He mentioned several, but did not mention the wolf mask. A week later, an official search warrant was served, and police found a label belonging to a Stanley 18-inch machete along with a receipt for the purchase of a machete from a local hardware store. No machete was ever found at the house. In the garage, the police found what looked like 2 coffins and 2 anchors, to which Mike would later confess that his first plan had been to tie Charles and Doreen up in the coffins and take his boat out to the sea and drown them just like they had his son. The wolf mask was proven to be his because he had worn it the year before to a Halloween party in which a friend had taken a picture. I'm going to discuss the autopsy results, which are pretty gruesome. If you do not want to hear this part, then you might exit the video now. Doreen suffered many cuts with the machete to the back and sides of her head, with some cuts penetrating the skull. The wounds on the right side of her head were particularly brutal. Some fractured the skull. One penetrated 2 inches into the brain. Her left hand was severed above the wrist. His hand was found near the baby's body in the living room. Her back and shoulders received severe wounds that penetrated bone. Her right breast had been cut 3 times and stabbed. Her legs and thighs sustained chopping wounds resulting in gaping cuts and a broken femur. Her abdomen had a 9-inch gaping wound. She also suffered many other cuts while her unborn baby was still inside of her. Her stomach and large bowel were cut open, and her uterine wall and placenta also had cuts to it. The umbilical cord was cut near where it had been attached to the baby. The baby was separated from Doreen's body due to her abdominal wounds. The baby suffered some severe wounds. He had a cut on his head that penetrated into the bone. His left shoulder blade was cut through. His right thigh area, including the penis and scrotum, were cut. His left leg was severed below the knee. The medical examiner also stated that he had a large 5-inch wound cut through half of his body. This one extended from his upper right abdomen through his left chest to his left armpit, cutting through the shoulder blade, the second thoracic vertebrae, the liver in one lung, and transecting the heart. This wound stopped his heart and circulation. In August of 1988, the jury returned with a guilty verdict for first-degree murder of Doreen and second degree for the unborn baby. Before the sentence was passed, Mike sobbed and said that if his death could bring back his son Paul, then take me now. He was sentenced to death by gas chamber in the San Quentin prison. But due to Gavin Newsom stopping all executions, Mike will spend the rest of his life in prison. Mike has an interview on YouTube. He seems to have no remorse for what he has done. In fact, he still sounds angry and states that Doreen murdered his son. Dina, now grown, states that I can forgive, but I can't forget. And I do think that he should have received the death penalty. I have to grow up without a mom and a brother. Thanks, guys, for joining me for Wacky World Wednesday. I love y'all, and I'm leaving the bloopers, and they're coming right now. Love ya. Bye. Subscribe if you would like, no pressure. I love. If you don't enjoy my telling of this true crime case, then don't subscribe. I don't care. I'm just that way. As my little cousin used to say, I don't care, Dookie dog. Oh, okay. Anyway, that's a side thought. Subscribe, don't subscribe. I don't care. I shouldn't even put it in there. How'd that rhyme? Look at me. Already rhyming again. Don't even meaning to. Yeah, me. Mike was a great father, but not so much a great husband. Some men that are a great husband, not a great father. Some men, great father, not a great husband. I suppose there's women like that too. And there's some that is no count and neither. This is my ADHD kicking in, going places that had nothing added onto the story. The gentleman introduced himself as Charles Erbert. He opened the hood of her car. Opened the hood of her car, huh? He was not worried about the pool since it was This is when Mike became the big, bad wolf. Do that again. This is when Mike became the big, bad wolf. Yeah, maybe not. This is when Mike became the big, bad wolf. This is when Mike became the big, bad wolf. This is when Mike became the big, bad wolf. Took Deanna trick-or-treating. Weeding at your feet, give me something nice to eat. She just felt too tired to walk. She yelled to do. Mama! What you doing? Come here. Come see Mama. It's hot in here. He don't want to come in here. I don't blame him. Do you blame him? All right, Simon. What you want to do? What you want to do? Oh, there goes my mom. He says fine, and he wants to go do something fun because he's tired of this hot she shed business. So we're going to go do something fun. I want to go. All right, let's go.